Hi everybody, my name is Alex Tyrrell. I'm the leader of the Green Party of Quebec, and today I'm here at Cabot Square in Montreal to unveil the party's platform for Indigenous rights. And we're here on the unceded territory of the Ganagahaga Nation. So the first thing that I want to talk about is recognizing the Canadian genocide. We have a situation where the United Nations definition of genocide, the criteria for that is clearly happening here in Quebec and within Canada. We have the criteria of murders taking place. We have physical and mental harm being imposed on members of Indigenous communities, and we have conditions that aim to partially or totally destroy this people, as well as things to stop births of children or to remove children from their parents' care. So, when we look at this issue, we have evidence of all of these criteria being carried out, almost on a daily basis here in Quebec. I visited an Indigenous community, the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, a little bit earlier this summer, and I went there because I had heard that they had a school that was full of mold problems, and that parents were being had to choose whether they should send their kids to a moldy school or risk having them taken away by Youth Protective Services. And when I arrived in this community and I looked at the school that they had, the first thing that jumped out at me was that every other school that I've seen everywhere in Quebec has been made of bricks, has had a foundation. This school that they have is 50 years old. It's made of wood. It's situated on top of sand with a crawl space in which there's a huge amount of mold that's accumulated. We have people, I saw, housing in that community, more poverty than I'd seen anywhere else in Quebec. You have multiple families, over a dozen people living in single houses with siding falling off, with, really poor living conditions, with mold, with all sorts of problems. We had people telling us about the suicide rate in the community, of people, having no means to take care of themselves and to live a decent life, and turning to suicide in large numbers. And I happened to visit this community on the same day that the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services for Canada was visiting the community in response to these media stories about the conditions in the school. And I was able to sit in on a meeting between the community, the chief, and these federal politicians. And it was really a sad display, because the federal politicians were saying, well, it's just a matter of figuring out what your priorities are, and we're there to work with you and all this. And we're walking through this impoverished community with these houses falling down, with these children being sent to moldy school, and hearing like, oh, it's just about determining your priorities. When in reality, what's happening to the Algonquins of Barrier Lake is not unique in Canada. It's something that's very much widespread. And on this trip, I realized treatment for addictions and that sort of thing is all designed to make these people not exercise their constitutional and treaty rights to the land. So when I returned from that visit, I put the issue of recognizing the ongoing genocide in Canada and in Quebec amongst the top policies, the top social justice policies in the Green Party of Quebec platform. The second big thing that we are announcing today for Indigenous rights and reconciliation is land back. So, when colonization started, 100% of this land belonged to the Indigenous peoples. And, through the colonization process, Indigenous peoples have been pushed onto very small reservations, very, very small places. And, in many of these communities, whether it's, Barrier Lake, or whether it's Ganasatake, there's very limited room for expansion, and a lot of these communities have a population increase and have no place to set up new homes and to expand their community. And it's one of the things that pushes people into such close quarters of living 2 or 3 or 4 families under one roof. So the Green Party of Quebec supports land back, and what we mean by land back is not necessarily giving 100% of the land back, but certainly expanding all the communities that need access to this land, and giving back sections of traditional territory to the Indigenous nations so that they can practice their traditional way of life without fear of outside development, or without fear of the provincial government authorizing mining projects without their consent and that sort of thing. There has to be a certain amount of respect that's shown by the provincial government. And I've seen the provincial government sign agreements, for just a few $1 million with different First Nations in exchange for the rights to huge swaths of land that's being used for forestry and for mining. And these communities are not seeing the benefits of these projects. And I was at a debate earlier this morning, and the Conservative candidate said, well, if we want to help Indigenous people, we should just have them develop their natural resources, extract oil and extract forestry and that sort of thing. I don't accept that the government is putting people into a situation where they have to exploit their resource, where they have to sacrifice their land just in order to get by and to have access to clean drinking water and decent health care and education services. This is a complete injustice, and the Quebec government needs to do much better. It needs to recognize what's taking place and put policies into place to change it. So that's what we're hoping to do with the Green Party of Quebec and with our land back policy. We also need to fight against systemic racism. Systemic racism is something that affects people from many communities, but particularly Indigenous people, who are far more likely to be stopped by police, far more likely to be charged with crimes, far more likely to end up in prison. The Indigenous community is overrepresented in all of these indicators. We also have issues of systemic racism within the healthcare system. Look what happened to Joyce Echequan, an Indigenous woman who was, treated very poorly by the healthcare system, who was, given racist insults by nurses at the same time that she was screaming for help because they were giving her a medication that she was allergic to. And instead of looking into the problem and trying to understand what was taking place, they instead made racist comments. And so this is not something that's unique to Joyce Echequan. I completely disagree with Premier François Legault when he said in the TVA leaders debate that this situation has been taken care of. It hasn't been taken care of. It's an ongoing issue, and we need to do everything that we can to fight systemic racism in Quebec. And the first thing that Legault should do for that is to start by recognizing it and then posing clear policies to eliminate it. There's also the issue of education. Indigenous schools are funded far less than schools under the provincial government's program. And this is one of the ways that systemic racism creeps into our society, is that we say schools for everybody else are going to be managed by the province, and schools for Indigenous kids are going to be managed by the federal government. Well, it turns out the federal government doesn't fund their schools as well as provincial governments do. And then we have, the impacts of this that are felt, for many generations. It shouldn't be the case that an education, elementary and high school, for an Indigenous person is of lower quality than for a white person or sort of somebody from the majority community. We need to make sure that we are repairing the historic wrongs that have been done. There's so many Indigenous people that are have their parents who were in residential schools, or their grandparents that were in residential schools, who are suffering the intergenerational trauma that's associated with these colonial institutions that sought to destroy this people. And the government should not only be giving equal funding for education and healthcare and for social development, but should be giving superior funding to the Indigenous peoples to make up for the historic wrongs that have been perpetuated by the governments. And I understand that a lot of people, in Quebec and Canada may not feel a personal sense of responsibility for what's taking place, but I would argue that we have a collective responsibility for the actions of our governments, both today and historically. And we need to make sure that these things are reversed, that these trends are reversed, and that people are taken care of. It's not just other reports and more study that's needed. We need to take action. We've had reports. We need to apply the recommendations. On the issue of constitutional powers, the Green Party of Quebec is a federalist party. We want to work within Canada, but we also want a constitutional reform. We want a reform that would include in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms the right to a clean environment, the right to clean water and to healthy food, regardless of location. There's many Indigenous communities that are far off the beaten path, that don't have access to healthy food for a reasonable price. This needs to change. We need to make sure that it's a constitutional right and that everybody has access to these most basic things, including housing, something that we're very far from achieving in many Indigenous communities. We also want to amend the Canadian Constitution to have a veto power for First Nations. So if there's a pipeline project that's going to be built on a First Nations territory, then the First Nation should have the right to veto it. And that's not what we have right now. Look what's happening with the Wet'suwet'en, where the natural gas pipeline is being imposed on this population without their consent. We also need to recognize traditional governance. So traditional governance is something that's very important because the band council structure has been imposed on First Nations by the federal government with the Indian Act. We should not be imposing this sort of thing. We should be allowing First Nations to transition back to their traditional governments, and we should be listening to and respecting the traditional chiefs and the hereditary chiefs in the different nations. We also need to talk about language preservation. So there's many Indigenous people that do not speak their language or do not have access to the means to learn their language. And this is a direct result of the colonization process, of the genocide, and of the residential school system. So in order to repair these current and historic problems, we need to invest in language preservation and revitalization. We need to make sure that people are able to learn these languages. And it ties in very well with the Green Party of Quebec's larger policy on language, which is that every student in elementary and high school should be given 25% of their instruction in a second language. Now that second language could be English, it could be French, it could be an Indigenous language or an international language, but the learning of multiple languages is certainly a very important objective of the Green Party of Quebec. It gives people opportunity and it helps First Nations hold on to their culture and to their transitions. So that being said, these are the major policy planks of the Green Party of Quebec when it comes to First Nations for this election campaign. Obviously there's a lot more to do beyond the themes that I just touched on today, but it's important to talk about these issues and it's important to put them out there, and the Green Party of Quebec will continue to be on the front lines of the struggle for Indigenous justice here in Quebec and across Canada. It's something that we're very sincere and passionate about, and I hope very much that the other parties will be inspired by the positions that we've put forward today in this policy announcement to do much better when it comes to First Nations. Thank you.